Welcome, my name is Steve Winick and I'm here at the Library of Congress where I am interviewing Bobby McMillon for the American Folklife Center. Bobby McMillon is, among other things, a recipient of the North Carolina Folk Heritage Award. He is a singer and a folklore expert, and we're going to be talking about his life in folklore in North Carolina and elsewhere. So, Bobby, it's really good to have you here. Thanks for coming in.
It's nice to be here today.
So why don't we start with you just telling us a little bit about where you're from?
Well, I was born in Lenoir, North Carolina, in Caldwell County. My father grew up in the Cosby section of East Tennessee, just across the Smoky Mountain, into the Smoky Mountains across the state line. And my mother grew up in Mitchell and Yancey counties in North Carolina, and through a series of happenings, they met in Lenoir. My parents did, and I was born there. And so my father grew up in the Smokies, my mother in the Blue Ridge, and then in Lenoir was a furniture town. Mm-hmm. And so lots of people, well, we had neighbors that had been there for generations in Caldwell County, but there were people that came out of northwestern North Carolina to work in the shops. We called them the furniture factories. Right. From East Tennessee, and as well as Watauga, Nash, and those counties there. It was sort of like a melting pot. Mm-hmm. And my mother's parents, my grandmother and grandfather Woody, had a great influence on my early life. I was always close to them, and my grandfather, he ran a store, a grocery store, on the Wilkesboro Road between Lenoir and the county line. And he had come there in '49. One of his brother-in-laws had worked for the Brohill family, the furniture makers. Mm-hmm. And one of the brothers of the owners of the furniture company that run the sawmill end of it had an apple house that he wanted my grandfather to turn into a store, and that's how he wound up in Caldwell County from Mitchell County. All right. And so I grew up around them a lot, but my grandfather kept his home in the mountains. He had he had two houses up there actually. One that he built for his oldest daughter that they didn't live in it long, but the other one is the home that my mother grew up in, and he kept them after he went to Lenoir. And so as a child, I would spend a lot of time up there with them when they'd go in home. Mm-hmm. And one of my mother's two sisters married a man in Yancey County across the river from where my mother grew up, and raised her family there. And I had three boy cousins that I grew up around, and their daddy's mom and dad used to tell us tales. They were both born in the late 1800s. Uh-huh. and they had a lot of stories to tell, a lot of witch tales and Hank tales and booger tales. Mm-hmm. And
so that was your first experience of stories,
with stories, that family, was listening to that family, and as well as my parents and my aunts and uncles would tell about things that had happened to them. There'd be bear tales and stories about mountain lions, which in our part of the country we always called painters. Mm-hmm. Rather than panthers. Right. And usually they were black painters. Mm-hmm. And they're still being seen down there. Although the word out from the Forest Service is that there aren't any,
but the stories are still there.
But the stories are still there, yeah. And my youngest brother just saw one a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. On his property. But anyway, that's beside the point. I loved to hear those stories as a child, and when I was about, well, from my father's side, there were a lot of stories about blockading or moonshining in East Tennessee. The Cosby section had one of the biggest reputations of making moonshine of any of the areas. I know every place like Wilkes in North Carolina and different counties had their famous spots for making liquor, but Cosby was one of them, and that's where they invented the submarine still. And it would only let a little bit of smoke out from underground. It was underground, you see. And if the moon was shining, it would shine on that little puff of smoke, and they called it silver cloud,
gotcha.
the liquor.
Nice.
So I got a lot of stories from them. Mm-hmm. And as I grew a little older, I asked my grandfather at his home, he had a Victrola talking machine and a lot of old records, and I would play those. And I asked him one time who did he like the best of those singers when he was, you know, younger man and lived up there in Mitchell County. He said, well, he guessed the Chuck Wagon Gang and the Carter family was about his favorite. And so, since I was real close to him, I began to pay attention to what they were singing. Mm-hmm. And it really appealed to me as well. But a little bit after that, I began to notice that there were certain songs in the community that people were singing that was similar to some of those records that my grandfather had, but some of them would have different tunes and different verses, or maybe more verses, or even less. And so I got curious about it, and I love to hear them sing. And so I began to write down songs that were known in my family. My dad's oldest brother married a girl in his home community at Cosby in Tennessee, and her mother, I always knew her as Mama Phillips. She was my blood grandmother, but she was my first cousin. But I always knew her as Mama. She was a singer, and she loved for me to come and get her to sing, and me to sing with her too sometimes. And she taught me at least 100 of the old songs that she grew up with in the Smoky Mountains in the early 1900s, and well, throughout her life.
So you sing some of those songs today?
And some of those songs I sing today. Mm-hmm. When I was 16, my English teacher at high school, her family went to church where my grandfather preached. He was a Primitive Baptist elder, and I had grown up in that church. And she knew that I liked old music, and she had taken a class at Appalachian under Dr. Cradis Williams. Yeah. And she thought that it'd be interested if I met him, and so she made an appointment and took me up there to Boone. And I showed him what I had written down, and he said, you know, in order to document it, he wrote it out in the book, showed me how to put down who I'd learned from, something about them and their age, and he said, someday that'll mean more to you than you think of. Sure. That it will. And I thought, well, you know, that's just something I like, and I didn't really have any ambition about getting in public or doing anything like that more, that it was just interesting to me. Because I never did feel like I was a good singer, but somebody had to learn them. And I seemed to be nominated in that neck of the woods. So I kept at it, and I would write down all the songs that Mama Phillips, and as it turned out, a woman that her and her husband, we had rented a home from them when I was just about 3 years old. She used to sing and play music. And after I got old enough to know something about the folk music, I found out that she knew the old ballads too. And her family were blockaders. Mm-hmm. When she was a girl, while the old folks made the liquor up on the Brushy Mountain eastern Caldwell County, her and her sisters would watch out for the revenue men, and they'd pass the time of day singing those old love songs.
And what was her name?
Aunt Lou Brookshire. She was a host girl before she ever married. And she taught me a number of the old songs. Some of them were folk songs, some of them were child ballads. And she was a great one to talk to. Her brother, as a matter of fact, had written some songs about some murders in the Caldwell County area, and about one time an episode of getting caught for making liquor. And it was printed in the North Carolina Folklore. And I told her about that, and she said, what? And she told her brother about it, and he wrote and told him that he was the author of that song, and he sent him a copy of the book
that's great.
that it was in. But anyway, a few years after I'd met Dr. Williams, or maybe a couple of years, there was a senior citizens group in Lenore that invited him to come and speak to their group, and he had another appointment at that time, and he referred him to me. And so that was the first time I actually got up in public and sang anything. And,
wow. And how old were you at that time?
I was about 18.
Uh-huh.
And but the odd thing was, once I got up there, it didn't bother me to sing. The people it didn't frighten me or anything. It was preparing beforehand that made me nervous.
Right.
And so that started me singing once in a while for a group like that. And then about, and all this time I was still learning songs from a lot of the old people. One of the Mr. Ballhill, his son operated the sawmills they had for the Ballhill people. And he loved old music, and one of his workers was a man named Rolf Ellison. And they called him Smiley because he didn't have any teeth. And he brought him down to my grandpa's one time, and he had a banjo there and a guitar, and he was playing some Earl Scruggs style something. I asked him if he didn't know any of the older songs, and he said, "Oh, you're wanting something like Little Birdie?" And I said, "Well, that'll work." And he pulled the the finger picks off, and went to playing that the old way. And then I forgot just what I asked him, but he said, "You mean you're wanting something like Lord Daniel, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, that'd be fine." And he played Lord Daniel and the House Carpenter and 2 or 3 of them on the banjo. And that began a lifelong acquaintance with his family. His daddy was what Dr. Williams called a ballad. I can't think of the term. A ballad rhymer. Okay. He'd write ballads about things that happened up in Watauga County, in an area near Meat Camp called Pottertown. He was related to all those people. And one of the songs that he had written about his cousin Birchie Potter, who was killed by Glenn Brown, his cousin, Uncle Bill Ellison wrote the song, and he gave a copy of it to his cousin Jim Brown, who added a verse to it, and he gave it to a Presnell man, who turned it into the Watauga Democrat. Was printed in the paper at Boone, and then that's how the Brown collection got a hold of that, and they printed it in the North Carolina Folklore. Right. So, but Uncle Bill Ellison, if I could have known him 20 years earlier, I could have had a stack of songs that thick. He really knew them, and but he was toward the end of his life and couldn't catch his breath real well. And a lot of the old ballad singers, they'd want you to beg them to sing anyway. They'd say, "Oh, I can't sing today. I got a cold," or, "You know, my throat's a little sore this morning," sort of like mine is now. But they'd really just want you to keep on to them till they'd sing.
Right.
And so...
so you got good at that? keeping on asking, and yeah.
That's right. And so, and he knew a lot of the story. The Potters were a pretty wild bunch back in those days, and a lot of killings had happened in the family, and he knew the details and told me those. Well, it was about 72 or 3 that I had attended Caldwell Community College, and I needed to work more than I needed to go to school. So I took me a job at a wholesale grocery store in Lenore, and they had me driving a truck, and I just got fed up with doing it, and one day I just quit. Don't know what struck me that particular day to quit, but I did. And that night, one of my 2 best friends called me and said, my uncle, T.R. Bryan, who was the only obstetrician in Wilkesboro at that time, wants to go to Union Grove, and said if you'd go, he'd be on call, but he'd let you drive his Corvette for the weekend. And so I said, well, I guess I could go. And then while I was down there, I met a lot of people that I would become friends with over the years. Barbara Ray, the fiddler from Madison County, and Betty Smith, and there was a couple there that was from Cosby that caught my interest. Their name was Gene and Lee Schilling, and they had a dulcimer shop, and they also ran the folk festival of the Smokies. And they were selling recorders and dulcimers at it was at the Fiddler's Grove section of they'd already broken the Fiddler's Convention up, and Harper Van Hoy ran the Fiddler's Grove. And I introduced myself to them and told them that I knew a number of songs that I learned from Cosby, where they lived. And Jean was the daughter of a famous bootlegger from up there, Isaac Allen Koestner. He was still in prison at the time I met her. Wow. Him and his brother had robbed the Charlotte Mail train in the 30s and was put away for about ever. But anyway, she said that if you'll come and join us to prepare for our folk festival on Cosby, said, I'll introduce you to Jeanette Carter of the old Carter family. And so that's about all the persuading I needed for that. And she was wanting to learn some of the songs that I knew. And so while I was down there, I met Jeanette Carter, and Jeanette invited me to come to where she lived at Macy Springs, Virginia, and see where Daddy was born. And we started the rest of her life, I knew Jeanette, and I was with her when she first started her music making down at her daddy's store. Right. Then they built the fold up there, the Carter family fold. But just a little while after that, my friend Cody Lowe, whose uncle had invited me to Union Grove, because of my interest in the old music, he needed an elective. He was taking RTV at UNC. So he took Dr. Daniel Patterson's folk song class. And he said, you ought to come down here and go with me to class one day. I said, well, I like to go to see him anyway, because I'd go in the library and look at the books and go to the intimate bookshop and record bar and have a good vacation away from home. And so I went and sat in on his class, and when it was over, he took me back to meet Dr. Patterson, and he said, well, what's some of the songs you know? And he told me later he was expecting me to sing something like May I Sleep in Your Barn Tonight, Mister, or some of the songs that were popular, in the 20s, right, 30s, maybe from recordings. And I sang him a version of Mellinger Henry called it "Home, Dearie Home." It was a body song that I learned from Mama Phillips, and then I sang in the House Carpenter, and his eyes started getting bigger. And before the day was over, we had become friends. And he took me to and showed me, gave me a private showing of John Cohen's film of End of an Old Song.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Dillard Chandler film.
Yeah. Yeah. And I said, well, wait a minute. He said the word was out that Dillard was dead, and I said, no, I don't think he's dead. I think he's still living. But anyway, from one of Dan's students was a boy named George Holt, who became the first director of the Folklife office at the North Carolina Arts Council. And another student, that St. Alan Tullis, who came to work for the Smithsonian, he was in that class. I met him that day. I think Kip Lornell was in that. I don't know why everything just fell together.
So you met a lot of folklorists all at once that way.
So yeah. And so it was about a year later that George Holt called me and wanted me to come to the first Folklife festival they had at Durham. And then I went to the second one. I think it was at Eno, maybe. No, I'm not sure. But anyway, it was just a couple of years later till Alan called on me and scouted me and a bunch of them from Madison County to go to the Smithsonian for the bicentennial. And in a lot of words, that's sort of what, got me started in this.
Sure.
Through George's efforts, I applied for the Visiting Artist Program and the Artist in Residence Program, and I worked in the schools trying to awaken the children's awareness of their own culture and what their parents might know at home. And then I worked in the community colleges for 4 or 5 years, and that was just a little summary of my...
Well, I think some of the interesting things that you mentioned, one, the fact that you got into the songs a little bit through first hearing some of those old records and recognizing that in your community there were songs that were similar to those. And I think that's a way that a lot of people who aren't part of your community get interested in those songs too, and then they go looking for them.
I thought when I was a child that songs were composed to be recorded.
Right.
And that's what threw me off for a time. And then by accident, when I was about 14 or 15, I was in the library and came across the Frank Brown collection of North Carolina folklore, and I saw all these songs that I was hearing in the country, and there were different versions, and some of them were longer and shorter, and that answered my question. And from that point on, I was hooked. But the best part of all of it was getting to know the people and sitting on their porches and talking to them and listening at them sing. One of my third cousins taught me the first of the old child ballads that I ever heard, Fair Ellender and the Brown Girl. I was at his house. My daddy had bought me a tape recorder, and his wife was singing some songs that she knew from the 20s and 30s, and he was shaving in the house. And about that time, I heard something about the lords and the ladies, and I said, Nate, where did you learn that? And he said, Pap sang it for me, and he knew the whole ballad of it. And it was like that you could, from that point on, it was always like it brought the past to real life. It was like I could go down the road and go around the bend and see somebody on a milk white steed or a castle sitting there. And I mean, these people that were singing had no connection with the old country, but yet they were singing. It had come by word of mouth to them.
That was the connection. Yeah. So, I mean, but that also opens an interesting question, which is, within the community, there were all kinds of different songs, including those really old ones that had references to Britain and Europe and steeds and castles,
Right.
but then other things like Tom Dooley, and
Right.
then the ones that even you met the people who wrote them. Were you aware that there were different kinds of songs like that originally, or is that something you gradually learned?
Well, no, see, everybody that sang back then, they might sing Barbie Allen and then turn around and sing George Jones's The Window Up Above.
Yeah.
And so I just realized it was just what they had learned, and then as I began to look more into the to the Brown collection and others, Cecil Sharp, I soon discovered him and knew how he went about it, and I knew that there were different versions. I mean, there were the American songs as well as the European songs, and it was all just a part of it. They didn't differentiate
Right.
between one. And another thing, one of my when I went to school as a boy, I lived not far from the Wilkes County line, and a number of my playmates in school and some of the older people that I knew in the community was related to the characters that were related to Tom Dooley. And then my grandmother told me the story of Frankie Silver, who was hanged for cutting her husband's chopping his body up one night. And she was the only woman, to my knowledge, that was ever legally hanged in North Carolina. And then from a great aunt of mine, I learned the tune from it. And then Aunt Lou Brookshire, that I knew in Caldwell County, knew a different tune, but she knew the same words.
And that was Frankie and Charlie Silver. Did you have a family connection to them? I thought I read somewhere.
Charles Silver's daddy was a brother to my great-great-great-grandfather.
All right.
And only in the last couple of years I knew that Charles' mother died when he was born. His daddy married and had a big family after that. But his mother was my grandmother's great-grandfather's great-grandmother's sister.
Okay.
So I was kin to Charles through my grandmother and my grandfather.
Right.
And but I heard the story as a child. My grandmother didn't know that connection. But I just dug it out, you know, looking through genealogy and finding out the facts of the case. But I could see that from my grandfather's house in Mitchell County, I could look out the back window and see where the spring ran into the branch ran into the river where Frankie was supposed to have walked and punched holes in the ice to make people think that her husband had fallen through.
Right.
And then up the road a little ways was some rocks where she was supposed to have hidden his lights, the lungs and the guts and parts don't burn easily under a rock.
Right.
But
well, that'll get you believing in the Haint stories too, right?
Oh, I was afraid to go out of doors of the night. We didn't have a bathroom in the house. And so at night until bedtime, you had to go off the porch. And I was afraid to go outside because I thought I'd see her spirit coming around the road with red eyes and a bloody axe in her hand.
So that was part of the story they told, huh? That is scary. And I guess that's the song you're mostly associated with, partly because of Dan Patterson's book that was about you and your connection to that song.
He was interested in my version of the story and dug all of that out to put that together.
So another thing that you've done, and you've talked about it a little bit, is your own collecting. You've visited with people with, I mean, you've done all the work that we're doing here, oral histories and folklore collection. What was that like, being a community member who also went out with a tape recorder and taped your neighbors?
It was fun. Up until I was in about the 11th grade in high school, my dad went and bought me a small handheld RCA tape recorder that would hold a 5-inch reel. would run either by electricity or batteries. But up until then, I just learned them like everybody else did, by hearing them and trying to remember the tunes. And I would write down the words. Well, then I got that, and then I would get them to sing the tunes. And then a lot of the stories, like my great uncle, my mother's brother-in-law's father, that told me so many of the old haint tales and stuff, I knew he'd be self-conscious if he knew I was recording him. And at his house, he had a big coal stove in the middle of the living room, and his chair was over yonder on the other side of it. And he'd sit and smoke his pipe. And there was a couch on this side of the stove. So I would sit facing him, and I'd have my tape recorder beside me, and I'd turn it on and record him telling all those old, he had some great old stories about things that happened in the Carter County, Tennessee, Mitchell County, North Carolina area in the 1800s and early 1900s. And those old ghost stories. And what I would do, I knew that it'd be obvious that I had something in my hand. I'd record a couple of Carter family songs. When I'd go in, then I'd play the Carter family music for them, because I knew they'd love that, and they did. And then when I'd turn that off, I'd just turn it on and let it record while I talked to them.
See, we wouldn't be able to do that, but when it's your own family, you
know,
you take liberties,
But I seldom ever done it. When I was getting music, only one time, Aunt Lou Brookshire one time, she wasn't quite ready to sing or something, or she didn't quite have the tune set in her mind, and she said, you've got that on, and wanted me to turn it off for a minute. But then after she got going, she had let me turn it back on. She was okay with it, yeah. Yeah, but most of the people, when I was recording the songs, that didn't bother them to run it. And, you know, I didn't, it was always such a personal thing. I really didn't, I was, you know, in books, I might have been a little more academic, because I was looking to find out where all this came from. But as far as actually going out and hearing it and singing it and sharing songs with the people, it was like always more of a family type atmosphere. And so I had to distinguish that. I got to thinking one day that it was odd that in Caldwell County, I knew the story of Tom Dooley well. I knew Cliff Brohill, that introduced me to the Ellison family, also introduced me to an old man who was born in the 1880s, who was the grandson of one of the Dooley women that lived in Tom Dooley's days, and he knew a version of it that wasn't like the Kingston Trios at all. And he told me the whole story. And but also the songs that I learned from the families that I knew real well, the Potters, all lived on the border of Ashe and Watauga County, and my mother's people lived from the southern part of Avery County all through Mitchell and Yancey County. And then I became just almost a member of the family of the Wallens over in Sodom in Madison County. And I knew them, well, from back in those days till now. And then my daddy grew up one county from Madison, the next door county in Tennessee. And so I was really lucky. And then also my father, growing up in the Primitive Baptist Church, they always sang from the shape notes, hymnals, after they had books that had the notes in them. And I noticed early on that, you know, many of the tunes was in a real similar style to the way they sang at church. They were often in a minor key, and when anybody would, not many of the people could read the notes, although they had singing schools. But the style would be very similar to the ballad singing.
And did people ever sing those church songs at home as well, like sing some of the religious songs?
Right. Mama Phillips, who grew up there on Cosby, she taught me a number of the songs that she learned growing up. She'd sing right. One was called "The Old Churchyard." It was an old song, and I always loved that because it had such a haunting tune to it. And then, when she was a young girl, she'd go to camp meetings. They had other kind of Baptist churches over there too, and Methodist, and And she taught me one. I do believe without a doubt Christians has a right to shout, I'm happy, I'm happy. Oh, may the Lord continue with me. And she learned those at camp meetings. Mm-hmm. And when the last trumpet shall sound. Right. They were all put together, lumped together, the meeting house songs that she called them. They always called them love songs everywhere that I ever lived and went to up in there. They were always known as love songs, unless they were religious. Mm-hmm. And then they were called meeting house songs.
Gotcha. So the old ballads, as well as the sort of Tom Dooley style ballads, those were all kind of called love songs.
They were love songs, right. Well, if you had them written down now, they were called ballads. Ballads,
right.
Or song ballads.
Right.
And but church house songs or meeting house songs were the only differentiation they had between the two. But Tom Dooley was a love song, just like the great Titanic.
Yeah, or Fair Ellender.
Yeah,
right. All right. So let's talk a little about the North Carolina Heritage Award. How did you find out that they'd selected you for that?
That was in, I guess you're asking me something now. My short-term memory ain't good as it used to be. I can tell you hundreds of songs.
Right.
Trying to remember what happened on a certain time. Yeah, in 2000, through an acquaintance with Sheila K. Adams, a man from New York named Jerry Epstein had me to go to England. He made appointments at different folk clubs for a month over there. And so I got to go to England and Wales and Ireland. And later that year they called me. I don't know who. It might have been Wayne Martin, who is, well, he's over the Arts Council now rather than the Folklife Center, I guess. I believe he's the one that called and told me that they had picked me to be the one of the recipients of the North Carolina Folk Heritage Award. And he said, by the way, you'll also be the youngest that we've ever selected. I said, you thought I was going to die, didn't you? Wanted to get it to me before I kicked the bucket. But I think it was Wayne that called me and told me about that. And that was really enjoyable. It's funny. That was a really good year. I got that award. Got to go to England, and then a woman named Sarah Gray was in charge of the Pinewoods. What's it? The Pinewoods.
The Pinewoods Folk Music Camp.
At Plymouth, Massachusetts, and they were having bunches over from England and Ireland, and she invited me and my sister-in-law to go up and be there that week. So it was a real eventful year.
Yeah, that sounds great. Oh, one other thing to ask about. We did mention your connection to Daniel Patterson, Dr. Patterson, but he wrote a book essentially about you and about your connection to the Frankie Silver ballad. So how did that develop? How did you get to be so close and to talk to him so much about that?
Well, Dr. Patterson and I after our first meeting, I always stayed in touch. And he would have me come occasionally for his classes, and he would get little grants to have me come and do some work for UNC, and of course he was in connection with Wayne Martin and George Holt and all of those. And that was one of the first songs that I had ever sung for him and told him that story. Maybe at one of his classes, I guess it was. And he used to have home parties sometimes, and I'd come to that. And he began to think that that might make a good premise for a book. And I told him, my mother told me a story. Now, I never heard it when I was real little, but my mother told me that she said, you know, up there where Frankie's cabin was, after the old cabin fell in, there was another one built where the fireplace was, and it had begun to fall in by the time I came along. And Mama said that one time we were all, went for a walk and just walked up the holler where that happened. And she said that there was, I can't remember now if it might have been a crabapple tree. There was a tree that grew up there, and she said she always heard that if you got into it, you couldn't get out without help. And she said, I must have been about 2 or 3 years old. She said, sure enough, I went right up in that tree, and I couldn't get out to save my life. I probably got tangled up in it, I don't know. But she had to get me out. And Dan thought that that would make a great title for the book, so he called it A Tree Accursed, Bobby McMillon and Stories of Frankie Silver. And my grandmother's uncle, Lat Hughes, told the story a little different than most anybody around there ever had. He said that her father, Frankie's father, ate supper with him the night Charlie got killed. And when he got done eating, he said, I think I'll lay down. And she told him she'd laid a sheepskin in front of the fireplace, thought he'd want to play with the baby till he got sleepy. And when he went to sleep, her daddy said, now's your time, Frankie. Now's your time. And so she went and got the axe. He'd done sharpened it after he got through cutting up the wood. And she'd rear back at him to hit him. He's laying on his back. Said every time she would, he'd smile at her in his sleep. Wow. And she done that about 3 times. And every time she'd give up and wouldn't do it. She said, I can't kill him, Dad. Said, he's smiling at me in his sleep. And her daddy said, if you don't kill him, I'll kill you. And finally, he talked her into taking a whack at him. And she gave him one lick to the head and run and jumped into bed. And her daddy, they said that he cut his head off with such force that the head bounced the rafters and blood went everywhere. And he chopped him up and done the rest himself, put on his boots and went down to the river. And that was never in any of the official stories about that. But Charles, his father, that lived in the old log cabin, which is still there, by the way, and still able to be lived in. It's the best log house you's ever in. When I was a kid, the Silvers that inherited it, his wife was my grandmother's first cousin. And Will Silvers told my grandfather, Woody, that he believed that the reason that Charles was killed, that her people wanted to go west. And that they needed Charles to get his daddy to give him his portion of the property so he could turn it into traveling goods. You know, people think that in the old days they just jumped on a horse or took off walking or something, but they had to be provisioned back then, just like now.
It was worse, you couldn't stop at a store. Yeah.
That's right, that's right. And Charles wouldn't do it. he just wouldn't do it. And they said that it was through anger over that he was believed that that's what killed Charles. But she wouldn't tell on her daddy.
Yeah.
And so she was hanged.
And so that's a whole other story from what the song usually tells.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Very
Yeah,
interesting.
she made a confession, but the confession was lost.
Right.
That she made, and then on the scaffold, she started to speak, but her father was in the crowd and said, "Die with it in you, Frankie. Die with it in you." And she wouldn't tell.
All right. So are you going to sing that ballad for us later when we do the concert?
I probably will.
All right.
Yeah, yeah. If I've got any voice left.
Sounds good. Well, we will let you rest your voice, and we will just thank you for this wonderful interview and for telling us some of your stories and your own story, the story of your own life.
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bobby McMillon.
Yes, sir. Thanks.